So if 5 people come into the bar within the space of an hour or 2, and each one leaves the door open, causing a draft, the bucket overflows, or at least it does in Steve's case, and an outburst occurs. If those same 5 people came into the bar over a 6-month period, and on each occasion Steve was sitting near the door, it is unlikely that he would have an outburst on the 5th occasion. This is because his anger would have been given a chance to leak away on each occasion before the next top-up. This building up is commonly known as the last straw that breaks the camel's back phenomenon. I prefer the image of the leaky bucket, however, because given half a chance your anger will normally leak away quite nicely. Recreational anger. The third point to be made here, and perhaps the most important one, concerns what I call recreational anger. Let me give you an example. Please don't be put off by the fact that this is a very extreme example. The same phenomenon happens day in, day out. Very early on in my career, when I was working as a prison psychologist, I came across a prisoner who was having quite a lot of trouble serving his sentence. He got tense and agitated and periodically smashed up his cell. I taught him how to relax and did some general counselling work with him, with the result that he confided in me that he had been beaten up by half a dozen prison officers in the previous prison he had been held in. I have no idea how true this allegation was, but that was what he told me. Anyway, he'd formed a plan that on release he would go and track down these 6 prison officers and one by one shoot them. I took this very seriously. A, because I was young and naive and took everything seriously, and B, because he was already in prison for having shot somebody, so clearly he had the wherewithal to do what he said he was going to do. Furthermore, he described how, on his previous sentence, he had done exactly the same thing. That is, he had spent time thinking and planning about how, when he got out, he would shoot this person. And sure enough, he had done exactly that, and here he was back in prison again for that crime. Now, it would be nice to think that young prison psychologists know exactly what to do in such a situation, but I have to tell you that I didn't. So we simply got to talking around it, him telling me all about how it was. To cut a long story short, he was in the habit of whiling away, hour after hour, fantasizing about how he was going to get his revenge. This apparently was entirely pleasurable, and time flew by while he did this. And this was the first case I came across of recreational anger. Anger which at the very least passes the time of day, sometimes actually gives you a buzz, and often puts you into a different state of mind, so that actions which wouldn't normally seem sensible and rational options look just like that. Going back to our leaky bucket analogy, it is as though you've plugged up all the holes in the bucket, keen to hang on to all the water there, and then just spend the time looking at the water. Or rather more literally, you do everything to prevent your anger from drifting away and spend time mulling over it. The best course of action to take in this situation is as follows. Don't do whatever your anger is telling you to do, and do something else. Let's expand on that a little. When you are very irritable and angry, it is as though that anger takes you over. The anger actually tells you to do things that in your normal state you wouldn't do. So who are you going to take more notice of, your anger or you yourself? Well, the answer is obvious. It's more important to be true to yourself than to some temporary state of anger. On the other hand, it is very difficult simply to refrain from doing something. Rather like not thinking of a giraffe. It is virtually impossible. If someone tells you not to think of a giraffe, a picture of a long dappled neck springs into mind no matter how carefully you try to obey. In the same way, not to do what your anger tells you is very tricky indeed. getting away from anger? The answer is to concentrate on doing something else. Anything. Real-life examples of alternatives that people turn to in this situation include the following. Take physical exercise. Walk, run, swim. Read a book, magazine, newspaper. Watch television or listen to the radio. Go and do some gardening. Phone up or go and see a friend. Simply take yourself out of the situation and go somewhere else. All of these are equivalent to doing something else, and that is sufficient for most of us. In the case of the prisoner I was just telling you about, tactics such as reading a book would not be sufficient because he had a long-term problem, 10 times the size of anything afflicting most of us. Nevertheless, with him, we adopted exactly the same strategy, and he did indeed do something else. He got in touch with a woman who ran a hostel for ex-prisoners, and wrote to her to see whether there was somewhere he could stay after his release. Thank goodness she wrote back telling him that might well be an option, and most importantly including a photograph of the actual hostel. I am sure that it was that photograph that really swung it for him. Now he could literally envisage what else he could do upon leaving prison. Rather than going up to his previous prison and slowly stalking the 6 prison officers concerned, he could catch a train to this hostel and settle there. Happily, it was in a totally different part of the country. Well, all that sounds very sensible, doesn't it? So why don't people do it? When you feel really angry, and your anger is telling you to do something drastic, why do you tend to do it even though the rational part of you knows that this is a temporary state you're in? I think one of the reasons is that some people think it is more honest to give vent to their anger. Personally, I wouldn't go along with that. Honesty is a splendid characteristic when it means A, not lying, or B, not stealing from other people, but a very destructive characteristic when it is used to mean C, saying very tactless and hurtful things on the grounds that I'm only being honest, or D, simply giving vent to anger, urges without any thought of the consequences for yourself or other people. Give yourself time. There's one important reason why it is always sensible first to refrain from doing what your anger is telling you, and second to do something else. This is because once you have truly regained your emotional equilibrium, you can decide at leisure what you think is best to do about the situation rather than letting your anger tell you. Let me give you an example. Graham described to me how on one occasion he was so agitated by his wife Fiona's being friendly to other men that even while still at the party they were both attending, he was going through in his mind how he was going to leave Fiona, and more particularly how he was going to tell Fiona about his decision. He was relishing in a strange sort of way how this would teach her a lesson and how sorry she would be. And it was more by luck than judgment that this did not come to pass. In the car going home he was sulking, but in fact still rehearsing what he was going to say and still enjoying the anticipated effect. At home the sulk continued, but as I say, more by luck than judgment he decided to postpone the confrontation until the next morning and simply go to sleep for the time being. Happily, by the next morning, sleep had worked its magic. Anger had retreated to a back seat, and although the discussion was rather heated, it was not so vitriolic as it would have been the previous evening. So by accident Graham had followed the formula, don't do what your anger tells you, do something else. In this case, go to sleep. Graham is one of my favourite cases for 2 reasons. First, there are lots of Grahams who have not worked things out so well for themselves. In other words, men who have allowed their anger to tell them what to do and whose marriages have disintegrated as a result. Second, in Graham's case, he was able eventually to do a complete review of his judgments and beliefs rather along the lines of that set out in the previous 2 chapters, and ended up seeing things in a completely different light. The net result was that Fiona's being friendly did not simply become not irritating, it became a positive asset to their relationship once he realised that it was perfectly harmless, and perhaps more to the point that everybody else knew that it had no serious intent to being more than being friendly.